Welcome everybody to the CISO Roundtable discussion today, focusing on Ransomware and Recovery 2021, brought to you by Air Gap Networks. Today, due to a couple of different scheduling issues, we will have a lot of exciting conversations that have been pre-recorded and moderated by myself for Air Gap Networks or by Leah McLean with Cyber Future Foundation. We're going to cover off on a lot of different topics, speaking with people from the government, with the healthcare industry, in risk assessment, and finally in enterprise solutions, all covering off on strategy around how to strengthen your ransomware defense. So if you are joining us from YouTube, please just know that you can actually interact with us live to the right of your screen in the chat. If you're joining us in Zoom webinar, please be aware that after all of the sessions are completed, we will actually have a live Q&A with CEO and founder of Air Gap Networks, Ritesh Agrawal. Without further ado, let's start with our very first session. Amy Nicewick comes to us from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and she joins Leah in a really interesting conversation to talk about how the government is approaching ransomware and this ever-growing threat to our security. Take it away, Leah.
I'm happy to share that joining us from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is Amy Nicewick. She is currently the Chief of Communications Management and Cybersecurity as part of the Cybersecurity Division at CISA. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Amy. If you can please share more about your background, about what your role is, what you do at CISA, and a little bit about CISA for our audience, please.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we do at CISA with regard to ransomware specifically. So my background is originally in software development, and I did that for a while, and then I moved into more security focus, cybersecurity focus with a small information security certifications firm, at which I was a security engineer, and then eventually moved into the role of the chief operating officer there. I also ran my own business for a couple of years along the same lines of assisting with cybersecurity certifications such as Common Criteria and FIPS 140-2. And then I joined CISA just before CISA, or the NPPD as it used to be known, became a standalone agency within the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And at CISA, I am the communications manager within the cybersecurity division. So my team is responsible for external publications and stakeholder messaging with regard to cybersecurity operational activities, such as things like ransomware and some of the other things you may have heard about in the news recently. So we push out publications to our CISA.gov website and out to our uscert.gov website. And we also push things out, more sensitive things, through other channels. So currently we are in the midst of a ransomware awareness campaign where we are pushing out information about CISA's resources and services that we provide for our stakeholders. So we do this through social media, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, mostly through social media and engagements such as this, where we talk about, excuse me, specifically what we can do here at CISA to assist people in the state and local governments, or even private industry, as well as some of our international partners, with helping to prevent, respond, and sort of clean up after ransomware attacks. So happy to talk a little bit more about that via my presentation.
Excellent. Yes. So now you will be going into your presentation, and Amy, very impressive background, and no doubt that you and CISA have been doing some amazing work in this area to bring more information out and guidance around how organizations can reduce the risk to ransomware, as well as help around incident response plans. So we're very much looking forward to this presentation that you'll be sharing with us today.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And as you're pulling that up, for any of you who aren't aware, CISA had released recently developed a ransomware response checklist and campaign. So I will let you go ahead and dive in now.
Absolutely. Thank you. So again, thank you for having me today. We're really, really excited to work with you and our other CISA colleagues to help promote our very first ever ransomware campaign. And I explained briefly that I am in the Cybersecurity Division's Operational Collaboration Subdivision, and specifically, we are responsible for outward external messaging regarding cybersecurity issues that we help to investigate and help to resolve. So we launched this awareness campaign informally last fall, sort of a soft launch, but then we officially kicked it off on January 21st with our acting director's announcement at the Conference of Mayors winter meeting. So who is CISA? We like to call ourselves the nation's risk advisors. And that means that we provide information sharing, best practices through guidance and assessments, and response assistance. In other words, we work with you to mitigate the incidents and determine what happened. But one thing we are not is a regulator or law enforcement. So everything we do at CISA is voluntary. Our mission is carried out via strong partnerships with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, with the private sector, particularly critical infrastructure companies, with other federal agencies, and also some of our international partners. Our strategic vision within my area is to lead and integrate cyber defense operations across those federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial entities, international and industry partners, to rapidly detect, protect, and respond to cyber risks that target critical infrastructure. So to help users remember our ransomware tips, we are providing and promoting best practices through some concise, engaging messages and specific tips for organizations or individuals to follow. We developed 9 key messages with specific ways you can protect your data from ransomware. We began, as I said, on January 21st with Keep Calm and Patch On, where we discussed the reasons and the importance of patching your systems and updating your systems to help prevent cyber threat actors from getting into your systems and potentially exfiltrating your data, or even installing ransomware on your system in order to get money out of you for the return to you of your data and systems. So every 2 weeks, we put out a new message, and these messages are here on the screen. We are currently working on the "your data will be fine if it's stored offline" messaging. And then we will continue to move through these messages every couple of weeks until the end of May, at which point we are hopefully planning to release information about our ransomware strategic plan. As far as our resources on ransomware, we have recently stood up a new ransomware webpage on CISA.gov, and you can see the URL there, CISA.gov/ransomware. And this has the necessary resources to help you protect, detect, respond, and recover from a ransomware attack. So I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with this webpage and if possible, promote it and its resources out to your own stakeholders and other partners. The key resource we've been requested to highlight, though, is our CISA and MS-ISAC Joint Ransomware Guide. We also have developed a toolkit and fact sheet and provide graphics that I just showed you, actually, the messaging graphics, in case you want to use that in your own messaging with your stakeholders. On CISA.gov ransomware, web page, we have broken that into various sections, the first of which is alerts and statements. So the alerts that you'll find here are geared toward system administrators and other technical staff in order to bolster their organization's security posture. All of CISA's alerts, statements, and joint advisories from our uscert.gov website that relate to ransomware are on this web page as a reference. Then we also provide some guides and services, and this is the link where you'll find our ransomware guide that I just mentioned. The Ransomware Guide is a customer-centered one-stop resource with best practices and ways to prevent, protect, or to respond to a ransomware attack. We also have links to our CISA's cyber hygiene services, which has several scanning and testing services to help organizations assess, identify, and reduce their exposure to threats. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming few slides. We also have fact sheets and infographics. So this section includes some easy to use, straightforward information to help organizations and individuals better understand the threats from and the consequences of a ransomware attack. This is where you'll find our CISA insights on ransomware attacks. There's a poster that you can hang in your workplace. There's a joint technical fact sheet from our NCI JTF law enforcement partners on ransomware, what it is and what to do about it. And finally, we have a US CERT security tip on protecting against ransomware. We also provide links to some trainings and webinars, which include our CDM, Diagnostics and Mitigation training. There's an incident response training series with a webinar recording. We have CISA's webinar on combating ransomware. And finally, we have a recording from last fall's CISA Cyber Summit 2020 ransomware panel session. As I mentioned previously, we do have a ransomware toolkit, campaign toolkit, and you'll find those resources out here as well to help you push out some of the same messaging. And we have also concentrated a little bit heavily on our K through 12 education sector, and we have some specific tools and resources out there for K through 12 administrators, staff, teachers, and students and their families. A little more about our ransomware guide. Back on September 30th, 2020, CISA and the MS ISAC released a joint ransomware guide. And this is, again, will help you to prevent, protect, and respond to a ransomware attack. CISA and MS ISAC are distributing this guide to inform and enhance network defense and to reduce exposure to a ransomware attack. The guide is broken into two parts. Part one is ransomware prevention best practices, where we provide information about how to harden and configure your systems to just prevent ransomware from happening to begin with. But part two, because we are realistic, is the ransomware response checklist, so that if in fact you are a victim of a ransomware attack, we provide you with some steps to follow in order to help eradicate the threat from your system and who to call for assistance. So this is one of the resources we're promoting throughout our ransomware campaign, since it is available to the public and anyone can access this very useful guide. So I will provide a little bit more information on Zero Trust at this point. So the Zero Trust strategy model is being adopted by federal agencies and private sector industries in the wake of the recent SolarWinds attack and also the more recent Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. The White House has directed that all federal agencies adopt a Zero Trust strategy model. So Zero Trust isn't a new strategy, and it's been already deployed in many federal agencies and within private industry, but to date, not really on the level that's required to combat the growing sophistication of malicious actors. On March 18th, our acting CISA director, Brandon Wales, testified alongside Chris DeRusha of the Federal Chief Information Security Officer at Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee about the importance of adopting a Zero Trust strategy throughout federal government environment at the direction of the White House. So another useful guide that you could take a look at would be NSA's Embracing a Zero Trust Security Model document. And you can find that on our US CERT site, as well as I believe the NSA has posted it as well. So a little bit of information that that document provides is one of the thoughts here, goals here, is that you should adopt a zero trust mindset. So what that means is you would need to do this to adequately address the modern dynamic threat environment, which would require coordinated and aggressive system monitoring, system management, and defensive operational capabilities. So zero trust assumes that all requests for critical resources and all network traffic might be malicious. It also assumes that all devices and infrastructure may already be compromised. And it accepts that all access approvals to critical resources incur some risk, and you need to be prepared to perform rapid damage assessment, control, and recovery operations. So some embracing zero trust guiding principles. And in this case, a zero trust solution really requires some capabilities such as never trust and always verify. So in other words, treat every user, device, application, workload, and data flow as untrusted. Your system should always authenticate and explicitly authorize each access to the least privilege required using dynamic security policies. Should always assume a breach. So the system should consciously operate and defend resources with the assumption that an adversary already has a presence within your environment. System should deny by default and also heavily scrutinize all users, devices, data flows, and requests for access. This would include logging and then inspecting and continuously monitoring all your configuration changes, resource accesses, and network traffic for suspicious activity. And also you need to verify explicitly. So all access to all resources should be conducted in a consistent and secure manner using multiple attributes, both dynamic and static, to derive some confidence levels for contextual access decisions to resources. So leveraging your zero trust design concepts. So things to think about when you're designing a zero trust solution would be that you need to define your mission outcomes. So you would derive the zero trust architecture from organization-specific mission requirements that identify your critical data, assets, applications, and services, or DAAS. You need to architect your system from the inside out. So first, you would focus on protecting your critical DAAS. And then secondly, you would secure all paths to those services. You should also determine who and what needs access to your DAAS to create access control policies. So you would create security policies and apply them consistently across all environments, your LAN, your WAN, endpoint, perimeter, mobile, all of that. And you should also inspect and log all traffic before acting. So you should establish full visibility of all activity across all layers from endpoints and the network to enable analytics that can detect any suspicious activity. So zero trust is helpful in preventing ransomware and limiting the damage if a malicious actor gains access to a victim's networks. So please note that a successful zero trust model involves both a comprehensive external and internal security model and a change of mindset by those who use it. Zero trust prevents the malware and the threat actor from moving laterally through the victim's network and encrypting or exfiltrating data on other systems besides the specific endpoint that was initially compromised. So it may not help with the initial victimized system, but it will limit the damage done a great deal once the actor is in your system. So many ransomware attacks are only noticeable when the attack is underway and can't be stopped unless there's a comprehensive and dynamic zero trust strategy in place. Some internal strategies for network victims really center around early and dynamic detection protocols that show when large files are being exfiltrated and are being accessed at odd hours, especially at nights or on weekends. Once any suspicious activity is detected, network sectors are shut down along with shadow automated backups. If these procedures aren't automated and dynamic, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to stop a ransomware attack. Also, attackers are not discriminatory about what they steal. They will steal everything. So pull that plug. So if you'd like more information about these zero trust resources, you can go to our US CERT site under this rather lengthy URL. But it's called NSA Releases Guidance Zero Trust Security Model. That is our notification of it. And then you can also find the actual document itself here at media.defense.gov. So a big question we always get is, who should we call? CISA provides no-cost resources that include policy-oriented or technical assessments, cyber exercises, cybersecurity advisors, and CISA information sharing. You should also reach out to the FBI or the US Secret Service so they can try to identify the threat actor and bring them to justice. As I mentioned, we are not law enforcement. We are there to help you prevent and respond to attacks like these. We've provided some points of contact here for you to reach out to, as well as a link to our ransomware page on CISA.gov. So I welcome you to contact us if you'd like to request any of our ransomware campaign material or would be interested in participating in events or sharing information on ransomware. And thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate your continued support protecting critical assets out in our nation. Thank you.
Amy, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing this presentation with us. Very educational, informative, and just with great information. Truly appreciate that. And, you know, I think it's great to see that the White House is going to be adopting a zero trust strategy, and all the volunteer work that you and CISA do in partnerships with federal, non-federal organizations is phenomenal. Those key messages you mentioned to help organizations keep calm, patch on is one of them, one I love. I think it's great. Couple of questions though for you, just to kind of follow on from what you presented.
Mhm.
How is this initiative or campaign new or different from other previous directives? If you can just touch on that a little bit for the audience.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So ransomware attacks, especially those from foreign malicious state-sponsored attackers, they've caused all sectors of the economy, from government to the private sector, manufacturing, national security providers, and healthcare, as well as schools and universities, billions of dollars of lost revenue, loss of intellectual property, stolen personal information to a degree not seen by other types of cyber attacks. So the FBI estimates that a ransomware attack occurs in the US about every 11 seconds, and on average can cost about $250,000 per incident for the ransom itself. But that doesn't even count the costs of lost revenue and mitigation and recovery activities. Some ransomware attacks have cost hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue and have taken down entire manufacturing companies for days. Some of the ransom that have been demanded have exceeded $40 million. So CISA considers ransomware attackers a national security threat to the nation's critical infrastructure. So in that sense, this is different, just because ransomware by its own nature is different than other types of attacks.
Yeah, wow. I mean, 11 seconds, it was definitely, you took more time to answer that than that time that passed. So that's
That's
scary for sure. You know, but for organizations big or small, what would be that kind of short list for best practices? You definitely touched on in your presentation how you're helping organizations and individuals better understand the threats and consequences of ransomware attacks. And you mentioned the webinars and trainings that you have as part of that, but what are some of the best practices, if there are others that you could share for organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I first would highly suggest that our listeners go and look at our ransomware guide. And again, that's located on our CISA.gov/ransomware webpage, and that'll answer a lot of questions in a lot more detail. But at a high level, we recommend that you follow a few precautions to protect yourself against the threat of ransomware. First of all, update your software and your operating systems with the latest patches. Outdated applications and operating systems are the target of most attacks. You should also educate your workforce as well as follow this guideline yourself, but don't click on links or open any attachments that are in unsolicited emails. If you don't know the sender and you don't really know what it is they're sending you, because sometimes they'll just send you a link and say, oh, look at this. And it might even be coming from someone you know, but that person would likely not send you something like that. Then don't open it, because that'll likely download some sort of malicious malware onto your system. We also recommend that you back up your data on a regular basis, but you really need to keep it separate from your device and store it offline, because if you have your backup, say you have a hard drive, external hard drive on your system, if you keep that connected, then the threat actor will likely also encrypt that. And so your backup would no longer be useful. We also recommend that you follow some safe practices when using devices that connect to the internet, like don't use public open Wi-Fi. Make sure that you're using some sort of trusted Wi-Fi and use passwords on them, etc. So in addition to those kind of high level precautions, there's some other best practices that you could follow. So we've released a guide, for example, for parents, teachers, and school administrators. I think I mentioned it earlier, that provides some information to prevent or mitigate malicious cyber actors from targeting kindergarten through 12th grade educational institutions. And they've been, so often leading to ransomware attacks, theft of data, and also disrupting learning services. You should also restrict your users' permissions to install and run software applications. Apply the principle of least privilege to all systems and services. Restricting privileges might prevent some malware from running or limit its capability to spread throughout your network. You should use an application allow listing, previously referred to as whitelisting, to allow only some approved programs to run on your network. So as opposed to deny listing, where you'd say, we don't want this to run, you would say, we only want these programs to run. And that way you know exactly what's allowed on your system. You should also enable some strong spam filters to prevent those phishing emails from reaching the end users. And you should also authenticate inbound email to prevent email spoofing. Another thing to do would be to scan all your incoming and outgoing emails so you can detect threats and filter executable files from reaching your end users so they don't open them. And finally, configure your firewalls to block access to known malicious IP addresses. And there are systems out there that you can use to help you identify what those are. And we do, again, go out to our website and find additional information. We do have a tip on good security habits, for instance, out on our CISA.gov and our US CERT websites.
Excellent. No, and again, thank you for sharing such great information that's very, very valuable. And I love the resources that you have for K through 12 as well. I think that's so much more needed too these days. For the small and mid-sized businesses who don't have big IT budgets, right? Because you gave a lot of great guidance and best practices, but if it's a small IT budget, any guidance you can provide there?
So I can't really make any specific recommendations on that, but I can tell you that we've been seeing more and more small and medium businesses contracting with cyber insurance firms to provide insurance and mitigation services as a third party. So the services they provide might involve ransom negotiation. That's actually a very big up and coming business. They would also hopefully provide mitigation, response, and recovery services for you. And they would also provide cybersecurity consulting and cybersecurity system design. So that might be an option to consider for businesses of that size. And we do have more information on that on our CISA.gov website. Try to use a keyword small business. And there's also a sub-site called Stop Think Connect that has some small business resources out there as well.
Excellent. And, you touched on this as one of the, guidance for folks of us to make sure, check on email and filters and everything else. Cause I think there was definitely an uptick of that last year when we all were work from home and digital, right? We were probably more targets, but, looking at the recovery or reopening this year and as vaccine rolls out, how do we put into more real world mandates for IT security practitioners as they're reopening and, coming away from work from home and moving more back into their offices?
Right. You are absolutely right. And that is one of the reasons ransomware is so much more prolific now, is because so many people are now teleworking and they're working from home, and their systems are not necessarily as robust or as well secured as their systems in the workplace are. So there are many mandates that are being driven by government, such as a recent one from the White House that directs all federal agencies to adopt a comprehensive zero trust strategy model. Fortune 500 companies and larger corporations have been employing a zero trust methodology of some sort for at least a decade. So zero trust isn't a new strategy. But small and medium-sized businesses are also being directed by the respective insurance companies that I just mentioned, or their governing boards or owners, to engage a cybersecurity insurance policy and a related program to help them design a cybersecurity system, also to help them negotiate ransom, train employees, etc. And again, we have more information about cybersecurity insurance out on our website as well. Zero trust is not an easy thing or a cheap thing to implement, and you do need to have a very concerted effort and really be committed to doing it. But I think if you are able to implement it, even if it's in a phased approach, it will provide you amazing benefits if you're able to succeed at that.
No, excellent. Thank you. And you hit it right there on, it's a commitment, right? Security, is not an afterthought. We have to constantly be maintaining that. Last question for you. The FBI does not support paying ransom in response to a ransomware attack. But furthermore, companies who are victimized by ransomware and firms that facilitate the negotiations with ransomware extortionists, they obviously could face steep fines from the US federal government, such as Treasury Department. So what do you think businesses should do in preparation for the ransomware attacks, not just this year, but beyond, given that?
Well, in addition to all those points I made previously about hardening and configuring your system, just plain old good old cyber hygiene.
Thank you so much, Leah and Amy, for such an engaging conversation and presentation. Amy, on how the government is thinking about this and how they're looking to help us in the future in the directive that they recently issued around ransomware. Now let's move into a conversation with two individuals in the healthcare industry to specifically talk about real-world situations. So we first welcome Chris Kissler. He is the CISO for Cognizant. And then we have Will Long joining us as a consulting chief security advisor with First Health Advisory. Let's get started. Well, let's move on to our topic for today, which is zero trust in healthcare. So I think I'm going to start out really quickly with asking you, Chris, if you wouldn't mind refreshing everyone on zero trust in the first place, because it's not a new term, but it might be new enough for some people for us to understand what does that mean in healthcare.
Well, zero trust has, I think, a lot of different meanings for different people, right? I don't know that there's a official Webster dictionary definition of zero trust, but in general, I think most people agree of the concept of not trusting different networks, different companies, even different users within our environment, and trying to do the best we can to segment and limit the exposures that those different areas have. You know, even from what we consider our trusted employees at home, right? You know, zero trust means not really trusting them, really, you know, what kind of protections can we put in place to trust those users?
So that brings me to the question, you know, with IoT, OT, and then of course the term I've seen recently, IOMT, Internet of Medical Things. We were talking a little bit before we got on air about how there are many different segments of devices in the medical care industry. And so wondering what your thoughts are on anytime a device has software and relies on a wireless or wired connection. We all understand that vigilance is required. What is your view on medical device cybersecurity, and how can we think about it across all the different segments of types of devices?
Well, I think that healthcare poses some unique and even more challenging areas, you know, in the Internet of Things or IoT or medical IoT. Some of those differences, right? A lot of the medical devices, or in the healthcare industry, we often call them biomed devices, right? Biomedical devices. Some of the challenges in those areas, they're not always on an expanded operating system. So often they're running on a very limited, small operating system. There's also multiple types of those that go into different environments. We have, you know, biomedical devices that go into our bodies, like pacemakers, cardiac. There's new Inspire, you know, breathing assistance for sleep apnea. There's insulin pumps. There's all of these X-ray machines and testing equipment. Some of them that are on those internal hospital networks. Again, for zero trust, we try to isolate those into segmented areas. But we also have to deal with these things that are implanted in people, right? That are going home, that are not on those trusted hospital networks, that are exposed to anybody walking down the street. You know, there's been issues in the recent 5 years, right? Serious issues for cardiac pacemakers that were out, and they had to do a revise, you know, update to those. There were insulin pumps that were very widespread in the industry. And at the time, that didn't even have centralized management. So they actually had to go one at a time to thousands of individual devices within a hospital and address those one at a time. And, you know, later they did, you know, add central management for those. But that's another challenge, right? There, for those biomed systems, there isn't always an easy push the button central management to go address that, you know, and you actually have to have staff go out to 5,000 individual devices, right? Can take a lot of time.
Yeah, I think I take this very personally. My brother is on an insulin pump, and it does make, you know, beg the question: how does he, in and of himself, protect his device? And so, and then we're also thinking about the recent Verkada security camera systems, for instance. So there's a whole other, you know, level of devices that these are just hospital cameras, security cameras, that those can be hacked. And then, as you mentioned, MRI devices, you know, so it's just across a lot of segments. What are some of your biggest concerns as we go into this recovery period?
Into the recovery period, I see, right, both people working from home, right? So now they're maybe not on our trusted network with all these fancy protections. So we've had to look at adding additional protections to their endpoints and workstations. And also, one of the aspects to recovery that people don't often think about is that actually the remote working from home has actually led to even more widespread remote working. And we actually are now facing some challenges in staffing, right? Which people don't think of, right? But yes, security staffing is a very desired field. And with more and more companies opening up that remote opportunities, we're seeing a lot of turnover in different areas.
So with big game hunting and ransom DDoS threats that are proliferating throughout the industry, what are what keeps you up at night thinking about those types of attacks?
The biggest thing that keeps me up at night are some of those large deployments, right? You know, I think it was about 3 years ago, there was a large DDoS attack against some of the DNS providers that took out, you know, specific regions of the country, right? Not just one city, but they took out entire regions with those type of DDoS and distributed denial of service attacks. You know, the insulin pumps were another aspect, right? And that vulnerability has been fixed. But when you have 10,000, insulin pumps in a hospital that could be either leveraged in an attack or that could be victims of an attack, well, that's a serious risk to public health, right? And luckily, those companies were kind of on the ball and fixed that pretty quickly when it was identified. But for a while, that was a big risk, yeah.
So as a CISO yourself, do you practice ransomware defense metrics against any particular compliance guidelines? And if so, could you give us a few real world examples?
Well, we do actually several. I mean, some of the most specific frameworks. My personal favorite is the high trust CSF, just because it encompasses 30 other frameworks and regulatory standards. ISO 27002. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is that FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has actually had specific guidelines for medical devices in place since 2005.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. And a lot of the medical device manufacturers, it was funny, when I was in the actual healthcare space, I used to actually see a lot of those device manufacturers try to say, oh, the FDA won't let us patch this because it has to go through all these reviews and this and that. And I would pull out that FDA guidance, which says, no, actually, the FDA guidance says that the biomed manufacturers do have to patch. They do have to apply commercial off-the-shelf patches in timely manner. They do have to upgrade their software, and they don't have to go through that full review, right? They are expected to maintain it and patch it just like we do our systems at home. But that was a huge myth that was propagated for years by a lot of the manufacturers, right? Obviously, because they wanted to maintain their profit levels, right? It costs money to do those updates. So my own personal perspective there, right? But there's one other, I guess, regulatory thing people need to be aware of, because there have been some companies that have decided to pay ransomware, which is something I personally advocate very strongly against. The FBI advocates against that. What they may not realize, though, is that there's a branch of the government called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. And if you buy, it's hard to trace, right, who you're paying those Bitcoin or anonymous ransomware payments to. And if by chance you pay that and it's one of their controlled countries or known bad guys, right, those fines are $300,000 per event or twice the amount you paid, whichever is higher. A lot of companies don't realize that and say, oh, it's 100,000, let's just pay it and get back to business. Well, that could get you in a lot of trouble. Right. Definitely not something that would be recommended to do.
Right, exactly. The sanctioned threat actors, you need to be very careful. And OFAC and FinCEN, I think, released recently, just in the last few months, some more guidelines around that because of the proliferation of ransomware attacks. So we know that the root cause of ransomware is often either a lack of visibility or a lot of lateral malicious propagation. How do you, within your organization, practice zero trust?
Well, and that's a key concept. In my opinion, right? Because security is always a balance with the business, right? We have to let the business function. We want to enable the business to operate, not block it from operating. So one of the key things that I like to focus on personally is that logging and monitoring, right? We not only need to generate logs so that we can detect an intrusion, but we need to be monitoring those logs, paying attention to either automatic generated alerts or having people actually review those logs for things that might not be as evident, right, in those automated things. I always like to say, right, there's no way to build a connected, fully protected network, right? There's always some level of risk that has to be there if it's connected to things and talks to things. So what I like to do is focus on building what I call a defensible network, right? One that you can identify those attacks or threats in a prompt manner, and one that you also have capacity to respond to those threats in a fast manner, contain it, lock it down, and then prevent it from being spreading, and then close it down, and hopefully, go back and identify the source of that attack as well. But that's the key point, is a defensible network with quick response to any of those things.
Right. And it's really a matter of a lot of people don't understand that ransomware malware, when that hits, that's you're sort of always already at the end of your cycle. They've already, that's the, and so again, once a malicious actor is within your system, unless you're looking at to see where is it trying to get to, and unless you have specific device controls and things like that to recognize when it's going after a specific device and that lateral movement, you may not see it until it truly implodes and encrypts all of your data. And so, how are you thinking about in a healthcare environment going back to full capacity? We know that this has been a strange year. We're talking about the work from home, and a lot of people are counting on the fact that this is going to be work from home actually at the hospital. It's going to be a hybrid situation across all industries, but specific to the healthcare industry with telemedicine becoming more popular. What kind of workbook or game plan are you pulling together to think about that in the future?
Well, I think that's really important to do because for me, number one, I'm a big fan of work from home, right? It not only do people often tend to get more work done, right? It adds another 4 hours to my workday because I'm kind of, a little bit of a recovering workaholic. But it also gives us a better defense against things like, the coronavirus and similar pandemic threats, right? If we don't have as many people gathering in a small environment, well, it's a much less risk posture, right? People are safer working from home. For those that do need to come in, maybe they can do a staggered approach, right? I'm seeing a lot of companies do that. I'm seeing a lot of companies also save money by actually shutting down some of their physical locations or reducing that footprint, right? And doing that staggered workflow. So I don't think it's anything that's going to go away anytime soon. If anything, I think we're going to continue to see it grow.
Right.
There's obviously, right, hospitals, we need people on the ground, right? We need people staffing those hospitals and ERs and emergency rooms to go work on people when they come in. But I think you're going to see that, reduction in some of those supporting roles for sure. And we need to accommodate that. And it's funny because the technology is there, right?
Sure.
The technology has been there for, gosh, almost at least 15 years, right? Citrix MetaFrame was a real popular method. A lot of companies are doing that now with VDIs, virtual, desktop interfaces for remote work. Well, we did that, for Cardinal Health back in, 1999, right? That technology was there. Just a lot of companies haven't rolled that out and are having to kind of do it in a faster pace than they would normally do. And that's where we really need to be careful, right? Is that people don't get too caught up in rolling it out quickly and pay attention to keeping the security boundaries in place as they do those rapid rollouts, right? They really need to not sacrifice security for the sake of time there and make sure they do their diligence. Yeah.
I heard you in a recent interview be talking about the lack of maturity and funding as a couple of different things that are really blindsiding the healthcare industry when it comes to cybersecurity. As a CISO who is greatly involved in that particular industry, and knowing that because of this hybrid environment, it's not just about the staffing work from home, but I had a telemedicine visit with my doctor the other day, and now you've got my phone, my computer, and the doctor at home's computer all working together to hold this one medical appointment with a lot of sensitive information. I mean, how are you thinking about helping the hospital and the healthcare systems to think more proactively about just the vast amount of devices that are going to come into play when you're coordinating that type of healthcare?
Yeah, no, great point. And really to piggyback on the funding question, right? Because a lot of healthcare or physician practices, especially the smaller ones, right, may not have a lot of money and structure around that. And I want to be clear, right? It's not just a matter of throwing more money at it, right?
Sure.
The important thing is, it's always a balance of, is the security spend worth the value? So very key is having experienced security personnel making those decisions and building a layered approach where the different layers complement each other, right? There is no, right, you've heard it a million times, there's no magic silver bullet of one thing that you can go buy or implement or do, right? It's a matter of coordinating and getting those multiple things to form those layers that complement each other and build upon those security things to get a strong security background and defense in depth in place.
Yep.
So that's really the key here. And even small companies can do that, right? I ran did the IT work for my wife had a mental health practice, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And we were able to implement that for, just a very strong security program for just a few $1,000s a year, right? But it's a matter of picking those right things and choosing them so that they're secure to begin with, getting rid of some of these old legacy systems. We have to, that's where I see a lot of challenge in healthcare is some of the businesses get stuck on some of those legacy biomed or legacy systems and are not upgrading them to more secure versions that were written for this decade of security, right? And IT. I don't see that as much as I used to, right? 5 years ago, that was a much different story. So I've really seen a lot of healthcare companies stepping up and paying attention now. So that's, if anything good has come out of the whole ransomware and coronavirus thing, I think that's probably it, right? Is I'm seeing a lot more healthcare pay attention and actually take steps to fix some of those things.
Sure. Well, and if we're thinking about them just catching up to this decade, and we know that the speed of technology is now actually a decade ahead of us, we've got quite a lot of ground to make up here. And again, I've been working in cybersecurity only now just about a year, and used to be in automotive, and automotive was starting to go to autonomous. And when you're thinking about this perimeter defense, people used to think of like, here's my company, it's a castle, I've got a moat around myself, I'm fine. And it's like, yeah, well, but have figured out how to go in little tunnels underneath your little moat there, and they figured out how to just cross over it when you're not looking. And so, like, how do you protect your individual rooms within your castle? How do you make sure, especially when, again, you're now counting on so many more individuals to be using various devices when they're connecting with their healthcare professionals? I think, again, going back to my brother's example of having an insulin pump, and a telehealth medical visit, he's now relying on this device that may not be protected. He's relying on this device that we're staring into right now to be protected. He's relying on his nurse's, or his doctor's device to be protected. And so companies realizing, catch up to this decade, but be planning for the future decade, because this isn't going to go away. I don't think having a lot of self-diagnostic tools at the ready for individual patients to be able to coordinate with medical professionals as opposed to constantly walking into a facility, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And paying attention, as you said, to where those things are stored, right? It's not the old castle and moat scenario any longer. I think it was Ping Identity, I think, who coined the phrase that, authentication is the new security boundary, right? Or paraphrase that to somehow, right? But yeah, our data no longer sits in that isolated environment. Now we are seeing, I guess, kind of a mix, right? A lot of companies, I said, are deploying that virtual desktop interface, or VDI. And in that case, all the data does stay in that data center, right? And can be surrounded with all those protections. So that's a great technology that I personally just love. But we're also storing a lot of that data in other places, right? I think people may not be aware, for their healthcare visits to their hospital, well, their data doesn't just sit in that one hospital, right? It's going out to insurance companies, to bill pay, to all these different agencies. We're seeing a lot of hospitals now as well, and healthcare units go into the cloud, right? They're moving their whole infrastructure out of the data center environment up to Amazon cloud, or up to the Microsoft Azure cloud or Google cloud. So they're moving those out, and you don't have that same moat protections. Now, what we do have in some cases, when it's designed properly, is actually even more robust protections than what we had in those legacy data centers, right? Again, it comes down to that proper design and layered. Authentication being one of those strongest things, right? I encourage everybody to implement multi-factor authentication for every account they have that goes across the internet, right? Everyone, and even some companies for their internal systems to prevent, as you said, some of those horizontal attacks. Once an attacker does get into the company, well, having MFA in place on those critical internal systems can help prevent a lot of those horizontal movement once they get in as well. It's not the cure-all, right? But that is one of my top 3 protections that I recommend as part of a good layered approach.
Sure.
Right? That must be user-friendly, right? Again, they're not all built equal. Some MFA solutions are better than others, and a lot of the legacy ones were really painful for users to use. Right, the newer ones offer multiple methods of authentication, where you could get a text, you could get a push notification, you could get a phone call, you could use a token, any one depending on the situation and where your data is. But that's one of the key protections I think out there.
Sure. Yeah, it's no longer going to the doctor's office and signing that HIPAA paperwork every time you show up is where your obligation as a patient ends, nor where the obligation of the medical facility ends, because now you're to your exact point, your data goes in and it goes out to your health insurance, it goes out probably to a secondary health insurance and then a different agent and things like that. So, and then if you're dealing with a complex situation, your data is likely being transferred between multiple doctors and multiple facilities based on what you're facing. So I think this is all really great information, and for companies to really be thinking, how do you not only protect your perimeter, not only have that endpoint protection, but furthermore, how do you really try to work towards a system that can isolate devices so that you can really stop that lateral movement. So Chris, this was wonderfully educating for me. Thank you so much for joining us today. Any parting thoughts that you have for people with zero trust in healthcare?
Be safe.
Be safe, exactly. Across the board, be safe. Coronavirus, it's not quite over yet, and there are a lot of things that are not going to change as a result of it. So they're here to stay. Everyone be safe. It's great parting words. Thank you so much, Chris, for being with us.
And we're very excited today to welcome Will Long, Chief Cybersecurity Advisor of First Health Advisory. Hi, Will. How are you doing today?
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do?
Yeah, great. Currently, I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Advisor at First Health Advisory, and we're a firm that advises organizations on connected devices, medical devices, IoT, and the broader security programs. In my background, I've worked in the provider and payer side of the healthcare industries in IT and cybersecurity for over 30 years, and been a CISO at a large healthcare organization.
Excellent. So for hospitals and health systems, the security camera breach raised red flags about the vulnerabilities of connected devices that are very prevalent in healthcare. So when we look at devices in healthcare, anytime that a device, telehealth or medical, has any software and relies on a wireless or wired connection, the vigilance is required. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is your view on medical device cybersecurity and some of the things that you're seeing in your day-to-day job?
What we're seeing is the proliferation of these devices and the technology advances and more IoT and medical devices entering these healthcare systems across our nation and globally is increasing the challenges for the organizations to manage all of the proliferation of these devices. These devices come with many different operating systems, embedded systems, and many different vulnerabilities. They take a different approach to managing IoT and medical device security than it does the traditional IoT or the traditional technology used in IT. Several of the hacks and breaches recently have highlighted the need for a holistic program around medical devices and IoT. The camera hack, for example, just goes to show how challenging and how many different types of devices across organizations need the vulnerabilities managed, and the organizations need to understand the risks. There's many challenges in the healthcare specifically, just managing all of these different types of devices, managing the downtime and the patching cycles and the interruption that it might cause on healthcare. Just managing the devices is a challenge. Just knowing what devices you have. Many organizations struggle to actually have a comprehensive asset management system that understands what they have. And that's the first step in understanding how you're going to manage your risk. You have to know what you're managing. So building that holistic program that has many layers of protection and many different types of protections and detection things that you have to do around IoT and medical devices that might be compensating controls and different than what you might have to do with traditional IT assets.
Okay, and What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that we will move into with the recovery when these device hacks happen? What are some of those challenges when you look at the recovery period and being able to resolve or come back from those hacks?
Some of the biggest challenges is this equipment and the managing those vulnerabilities and being able to test and know that your mitigations and your detections are working. Like I mentioned, one of the biggest challenges is just knowing what you have. If you start out with a poor asset management system and don't understand your posture, the devices that you actually have, it's very hard to come back from these and understand what your real risks are. It's hard to have playbooks and really have the detection and capabilities that you need to manage that infrastructure. So these proliferation of devices make it difficult if it's not holistically managed and there's not a program in place to manage all of the connected devices throughout the system.
And when we're looking at device hacks, are there any signals in advance in terms of, are you seeing this coming, or can you talk a little bit about when this occurs? Is there anything that you can have set into place to just at least give you any context that this could be happening? I mean, I guess looking more broadly, if you're thinking about your entire environment, right? What you have on premise, if you're in the cloud, hybrid environment, what sort of measures would you advise our audience that they need to be looking into with the proliferation of devices, but across those different environment areas?
Yeah, one of the things is really understanding the risk posture of these devices. One of the things about IoT devices or medical devices is those devices tend to do the same thing all day, every day. And they may be unlike a device that somebody is using as a PC or an endpoint, where different things are happening at different times. So medical devices tend to do the same thing constantly over and over again. An MRI machine, for example, is going to take MRIs all day. When the MRI machine reaches out and tries to do something very different, we call that an anomaly. And having the right tools and detection systems in place and wrapping these compensating controls around these devices to detect when these IoT or medical devices are not acting normally, or when a new medical device that was pulled out of the closet or was brought into the system through some arrangement with another healthcare system. If devices are brought into the system and they need to be assessed for their risks, they need to be understood so that you can monitor those devices. There are some unique things about these IoT and medical devices that make it where you can wrap a program around them where you know what you have and that you know what the vulnerabilities are, you know what the posture of those devices are, and then you can detect when those devices aren't performing as you would expect them to.
Excellent. And I'd love to chat a little bit and get your thoughts on, we're talking about the devices used within the hospital by everybody, all the staff, nurses, doctors, et cetera. The guest devices, patients coming in using their devices. So just in terms of broader security awareness to all the employees within the hospital and even to guests, what sort of plan should one consider in healthcare if they're needing to consider all the devices and where they're coming from with staff and guests?
One of the things to think about is, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, is zero trust approaches to how you deal with all of the different types of devices. There are many concepts in zero trust about access and segmentation of networks, for example, and keeping those. It's important for the the system to understand and the organization understand how those devices are different, how they're used, and what their risk postures are, so that they can properly segment the network. They can keep the guest devices, for example, off the production networks and segment it off. And really starting that journey to move down to a zero trust approach. Certain devices that don't need internet access should not be given an internet access, for example, so that if they don't need that for their function, they should be prohibited from getting to the internet, so that when malicious things happen to those devices, it cuts off one of the channels of communication for that device. It might exfiltrate data, download other malicious code, and if a zero trust approach is taken, it can then limit the damage that might cause from a breach. But it takes that holistic program and understanding the risk posture of those devices. And it's challenging in healthcare with that proliferation of devices, but not only the number of devices, but the different number of types of devices and how the posture is different and how those devices are used differently.
Yes, no doubt. And, you know, when you practice ransomware defense metrics against any particular compliance guideline, you know, specifically when looking at these the device hacks, what are some of those defense metrics that you need to consider and, you know, against certain compliance guidelines? We know HIPAA, high trust, et cetera, in healthcare, but can you just give us a few real world examples of what that looks like?
One of the best things I've seen done is using when testing understanding the use cases, understanding what the attack vectors and the threat, and doing threat modeling against your environment. A couple of the best things that I've seen used is one for a security operations center, monitoring a network, really testing your defense and mechanisms, your detection and defenses, and using the MITRE framework to gauge how your detection and defenses are actually working. That framework can help you understand what those attack vectors are, what are the things that the attackers use to compromise these systems. And through those different scenarios and workflows, you can then understand where your weaknesses are. So in essence, you can build metrics around where your weak spots are and how you're going to move forward. Another good thing that I've seen used is actually testing your security controls. There are tools on the market today where you can actually test through automation how well your security tools are working at all times, and repeat those tests, because things in these environments change. In healthcare and in many other industries, there's lots of change in the environment and the networks. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your controls that worked last week are working the same way they're working this week. And so automated security control testing, I think, is important. And when you put automated security control testing, even pair that with manual red team, blue team, and other exercises to test those controls, and you pair that with a model of the MITRE framework around your operations center, and you're really understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are, then you can be on a journey to measure yourself, measure your security controls, and it will help you develop that program and journey and keep raising the bar.
No, thank you for that. And you know, we all know the root cause of ransomware spread is from lack of visibility and lateral malicious propagation. Can you talk a bit more about that in terms of when you practice zero trust? You know, you mentioned a little bit before about some of what you're doing to implement zero trust, but in relation to that concept, if you can share some of that with us.
Yeah, visibility is key. And I always talk about starting with access first, controlled access, privileged accounts, least privileged access, and making sure that the role-based access, and start with identity. I've always said, if you get identity wrong, if you get the accounts wrong, if you get access wrong, it's kind of game over from the start. So really, I am a big proponent of starting with access, making sure that that all of the correct access protocols are put in place and procedures, and then making sure that you're getting visibility. Like I mentioned with medical devices for sure, segmenting these things off, preventing things from getting access to a network. Consider these devices, what's going to happen if they're compromised? Do they need internet access? Can they be segmented off? And can they only communicate with the things that they need to communicate with? And when you take that approach of only allowing the things to happen that you want to allow that device to work, and you get the access right, and you continue down that zero trust journey. Most organizations can't obviously flip a switch and be zero trust next week. I think it's a journey to get there, and you have to lay out a roadmap how you're going to continue to move, especially with healthcare and other organizations that have many legacy networks and systems, how they're going to migrate to a zero trust approach. And one of the things I tell clients all the time is don't make the problem worse. Start zero trust now and start deploying your new infrastructures, applications, and so forth in a zero trust approach, so that you are moving the needle in the right direction.
Yeah. And when I want to touch on a little bit from last year, right, with our pandemic. And I'm curious to hear from you with when things shifted remote, everyone working from home. Of course, I know that was different for healthcare. You were still very much in person, but just having to make that shift with accommodating for anything that did have to be done remotely, and looking at devices that were used, say, outside of the environment. What sort of changes did you have to look at then to make and implement, if you could talk about that, and then look from then to now, and I'd say even beyond today, in terms of some sort of a disaster recovery plan, for example, if this were to ever occur again, where it's another pandemic or what have you. Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think there were so many organizations, hospitals, healthcare included, that didn't have that game plan up front. But if they're looking to put that in place so that they can assure that next time such an incident occurs, there's more preventative measures in place. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations had to address awareness of moving workforces home and the different threat vectors. It really came down to understanding your risk and threat vectors based on what technologies you had deployed or didn't have to deploy and rush to deploy in some cases. Really understanding the change in that risk, how that information, what devices it was going to be used on, and how that was changing. And then you had to develop a awareness program and make sure you had compensating or mitigating controls for where those risks were. In the recovery effort, I'm recommending organizations really focus on what is it about their risk posture that's changing. As we come back to offices, organizations are going to need to evaluate those laptops, desktops, mobile devices, and other things that were being used off the campus or out of the office. Depending upon the maturity of that organization, are those devices, for example, up to date? Are you going to have thousands of laptops coming back to your environment that are, a year of not getting updates? Are they automatic? Where was the maturity of that organization's update infrastructure and patching? Was it able to handle that? What about desktops and computers and things that were in the office that have been turned off and sitting idle for a year? When a workforce comes back and starts turning those devices on, are they going to get used before they're patched and updated? Do we understand what our vulnerabilities are due to this return of devices or devices that have simply been turned off for a year? And I think organizations need to think about, what's changing and how does that change my risk posture, and what are the threat vectors and vulnerabilities this might open me up to?
That's an interesting point you just made. I don't think some of us realize, but you said devices that have been turned off for a year. So, something that I just think that was interesting that didn't consider that, but of course.
I can see organizations, if you had, even a small organization, you got 100 people, and all of a sudden you have a day where everybody's coming back to the office and, 100 PCs get turned on, and somebody starts browsing their email. Are those PCs going to be immediately updated with a year's worth of patches? Probably not. It may take days for that cycle to get through. And if there have been some significant 0 days and threats and ransomware and things that have been exploited in this last year that put endpoints at risk. And I think people really need to think hard about all these devices that maybe have been turned off, that how are they going to get them updated before users are using them? They're at a lot more risk once the users start browsing the internet, clicking on emails, clicking on links, and so forth.
Yeah, a really good point to bring up. Thank you. And then, with the recent device proliferation and unmanaged devices that were targeted in attacks like the big game hunting or ransomware DDoS threat, it seems almost impossible to monitor all the devices. So what keeps you up at night with all of those devices, or what advice would you recommend for being able to even account for monitoring every single device?
I think visibility probably. There's probably 2 or 3 things. Not knowing what you have. If you're in an organization that doesn't have an asset management system, doesn't know about their IoT and medical devices, and have a very good inventory system that's tracking those assets over time, that would keep me up at night. I think one of the things I mentioned earlier was knowing that your security controls are working. I think we're in an age, healthcare systems and other organizations are very complex organizations. They have complex networks, complex systems, and hundreds, if not thousands, of applications. And that's a very complex network, and there's a lot of change in these organizations. So my most recent answer of things that would keep me up at night are not knowing if all of your security controls are actually working. And that would include visibility controls, that would include other compensating controls and technical controls. If a control has changed and it's not working the way it was last week, if there's many risk assessments I've done and many technical controls that we've implemented over the past years, if those technical controls quit working, then you don't know that the risks and threats are changing and that risk profile is changing on you. And that would keep me up at night if I didn't know. And that's why I talked earlier about once you reach that maturity level in your organization and you have visibility, you have those tools in place, how are you testing every day, every week, every month? How do you know that those security controls continue to work? And how do you have that monitoring in place?
Thank you. And going back to patching for a second, the devices in healthcare, especially with telehealth, the IT transformation with the medical sensor mobility and just-in-time healthcare, what advice can you share for our audience to mitigate unmanaged or unpatched devices with the IP addresses in their facilities? I mean, you mentioned the devices that maybe haven't been turned on for a whole year and may have not been patched, within that time frame. So if you can share a little bit about what you would suggest for the unmanaged or unpatched devices, especially with IP addresses.
Yeah, really understanding the risk, having a good asset inventory, and really understanding the vulnerabilities of those devices. You can't solve all vulnerabilities across all of those devices. You have to understand what the vulnerabilities are and the threats against those, and be able to understand what vulnerabilities you really need to be addressing. And that's where a tool and an asset management system and a vulnerability management system, and really understanding the threats against those devices, where you can put a plan together so that you can work on the vulnerabilities. It can be a daunting task in healthcare or any other organization that's large when you have that many vulnerabilities across devices. What you really have to focus on are what are the ones that are really putting you at risk. Which ones have been exploited, which ones are 0 days, which ones are really a risk in your environment. And sometimes a vulnerability in one environment is not a vulnerability in the other one that you need to be working on. It can vary from organization. It can vary from network segment to network segment, whether you need to address that, because the context of the vulnerability takes into account the threats, but it also takes into account the compensating controls on that segment, that network, or that organization. And that's where having the right process and program in place helps you build that program so that you can have the right awareness with the teams, and you can then deploy the patches and work efficiently to address the ones that put you at most risk.
Thank you. And, the vaccines definitely starting to roll out now. There are even some countries who I think are saying they'll be fully vaccinated, everybody, by April or May. So looking at the general workbook practice for healthcare facilities, if you will, and as planning on getting back in full capacity, how close would you say we're headed in being back in full capacity? And then what is that general workbook of practice, would you say, to help get us there, as fast as we can?
I'm not sure I can answer that one since I'm not in a healthcare organization.
Okay, no problem. I guess to wrap up, though, 3 takeaways, and please keep me honest here, but you mentioned quite a bit, access, visibility, and awareness. Would you say those are the big 3, or do you want to elaborate any further on those?
Yeah, access controls, user access, network visibility is key, and awareness. Really building an awareness program with your community, with your users. Really driving that. It's a challenge in healthcare with awareness, just because the organization, the clinicians, are under a constant state of change. You can imagine with COVID and other things in the environment driving so much change. The amount of change on electronic medical records, pharmacy changes, on and on and on with all of the departments across the healthcare system, for example. Those clinicians go through an enormous amount of constant communication and change. And so driving a cybersecurity awareness program can be a challenge in an organization when you're trying to get awareness raised around cybersecurity, a very important topic, when end users are inundated with so many other communications and changes too. So it makes it a challenge, and you have to really get creative in how to build that awareness program, not only among IT staff, but among clinicians and other workers in the healthcare system.
Thank you. Would you say that there is some reliance on the broader community that could help with that? Or, I think if there were a call to action to our audience and in general, the broader cybersecurity community, do you have one for them that could help with that awareness that you mentioned that, it's a lot that you have to account for, but we all need it. Is there any sort of call to action you would leave us with today?
I think so. The organizations, I think healthcare organizations need to rely on the information sharing organizations and assets across the country, and really get plugged in with the local organizations that they can share information around awareness and programs. They don't necessarily have to invent all these things. Other organizations have had learned from mistakes and also had lots of successes with awareness programs. And so they can lean on their other partners in healthcare in their community and in the information sharing assets in our country to share that information on successes and build a better program.
Chris, Will, thank you so much for some enlightening information around ransomware in the healthcare industry specifically. As we all know, as we move into this recovery, not only switching from work from home, but we've got an increase in telemedicine and privacy laws and everything that is at stake within our medical system. It's super, super important that we think about these types of things in the healthcare industry specifically. And we hope some of those real world examples helped those of you watching as an analog situation to what might be happening in your particular industry. So speaking of risk posture, let's move on to an interview with Mike Davis. He is the CISO with ExactlyIT, and he joins us to talk a little bit more about assessing your risk posture and talking about zero trust and why it's so important. Let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CISO Roundtable discussion series, Ransomware in Recovery 2021. We're sponsored by Air Gap Networks and the Cyber Future Foundation. Today, we're excited to welcome Mike Davis, the CISO with ExactlyIT. He's based in Houston, Texas, the company in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hello, Mike. Welcome.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate you inviting me here. There's a big topic. Everybody understands that ransomware is getting more prolific and virulent, and automated AI, all that stuff. So, and as I mentioned to you in our pre-chat, it comes with a double whammy now, a data breach extortion. So,
Yep.
which they are putting people's data out on the web, and so they're doing it. So you got to take ransomwares. That and phishing, they kind of go together.
Yeah.
But you take those two together and you look at the technical measures and the non-technical measures to minimize. Let me get a little spiel here.
Yeah.
So what I've been doing this for a while. I've been in military, federal service, contractors, and then of course commercial, a couple of CISO positions. I love this position. So currently my current company does IT managed services and things like that. My last one did support for CPAs, and the last one was maritime. But I just love this job, principally because it's the 360 nature of it. It's complex, but I like complexity, right? And the holistic nature of it, people, process, policies, and products, it really just intrigues me because in essence, I'm a systems engineer that knows cyber and risk pretty well. So I like to functionally decompose things. I just wanted to give everybody kind of a little bit of background, but go ahead.
No, thank you. I'm glad you did. No, it is a really ever-changing landscape as well that you're dealing with. So having that systems engineer sort of brain and being able to look at the complex issues is really important. Yeah. So, we've been talking a lot, and almost everywhere you look, the cybersecurity threat landscape has changed dramatically, mostly because the broader attack surface and a ton of organizations and individuals going online for transactions, making just for a much more attractive environment for threat actors. And so we wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the evolving approach using a zero trust risk-based assessment. And also looking at how that helps you apply the process to cybersecurity risks in this recovery reopening 2021 period. So, Mike, we know you to be a strong advocate on the risk-based security assessment against ransomware attacks. Would you mind just giving our audience a deeper understanding of what that means?
Yeah, so fundamentally, it's basically a shortened view or approach to the NIST risk management framework. There's 7 steps and you go through all of those. So, but it's a risk-based approach so that the asset owners and operators identify and assess and understand the cybersecurity risks known and unknown, we'll get that in a minute, to which they're exposed, take protective measures, et cetera, et cetera. So this risk assessment then, the output is a prioritized application of the cyber protection mitigations, the protections and measures. And I call it a risk mitigation prioritization matrix. It is what it sounds like. And it's basically a summary of your risk register. If you don't know what that is, you probably need to get into risk management a little bit deeper. But it's basically 3 steps. Threat assessment, of course you want to do that for all the attacks, bad actors, system weaknesses. That's the risk identification piece. Then you identify solutions and methods for detection and defense. The mitigations, that's the risk controls. This is the standardized process. Then what we do is we just basically roll that up into a high value risk reduction approach. That is high value, meaning high impact reduction with minimal resources. Of course, those are the ones you'd want to do first, right? And that's essentially the risk implementing and monitoring. So what's it mean? It's really a triad. integrating cyber hygiene, vulnerability management. We all know that's right up there for a cause of incidents. Cyber threat intel, or what the future attacks might be. They call them TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. You got to pay attention where the bad guys are going. And then your top company risk, getting risk assessments. You integrate that, including IAM, which is where Zero Trust comes in. And that's, you come out with this prioritized risk management map.
That's fantastic. So, with your experience in the Navy and thinking about the public sector, do you see that Zero Trust practices are different between private and public sectors?
Well, my belief on cybersecurity is it's 97 or 8% the same everywhere. It's that last mile, they say, that last connection that changes. For instance, operational technology, right, and pumps and motors and all those sorts of things. Well, sure, the OT security needs to be specific for that controls plane that they have. But what happens then? It ties into IT, which is the other 95%. So that said, I don't think, excuse me, I think Zero Trust architecture strategy can be used for any environment. I don't envision any major infrastructure changes except what I mentioned earlier. That last mile is going to be a little bit different. And so, but as we all know, Zero Trust, you don't focus on your attack surface per se, but on your protection surface, the data, apps, assets, and services. What's a little bit different about Zero Trust architecture and what most of us do is we do access controls for people pretty well, we hope, MFA and things like that. This just takes that to the next level. The devices, services, and infrastructure components. So it's also data centric. So it's important to know where your data is and follow that around. So the bottom line is the methods of authentication may differ at that last connection. For example, the various OT devices, like I mentioned earlier, but the principles remain the same. So the standards used in the IAM, identity and access management, end-to-end may also vary a little bit, but if like 5G, implementation of low power wireless, WIGBY, and a couple things like that, but they're designed to be interoperable. So if you follow the standards, you're probably all right. But in short, build your Zero Trust strategy. What do you got? You got some of it already. You've got access controls. You've probably got PAM in place. You got password policies. Now you need to take the rest of that into account. Build your roadmap with ops and IT. Security cannot go this alone. This is one of those where you got to be tied at the hip with ops and IT, and then ensure leadership knows its major risk reduction value.
Sure, of course. And the Gartner research, of course, says that 90% of ransomware attacks are actually preventable, which is sort of working on your staffing and other issues within cybersecurity. But how do you advise on the defense strategy against that 10%?
Okay, well, yeah, I've seen that, and I completely concur on it. You can take 90, 87, 85, but yes, between cyber hygiene, access controls, and a few other things, I completely believe that statistic. It might even be a little bit better than that. But first, you need to acknowledge that there are a lot of practices that help minimize the ransomware risk. So I believe the 10% also includes people who don't do these very well. But be that as it may, secure backups. I'm going to say it again, secure backups. Everybody knows a backup is one of our major defense strategies against ransomware, except if the bad guys can get to it and encrypt that first. And guess what? That's one of the first things they do. So you're sitting there fat, dumb, and happy, but you don't really have a backup strategy. That kind of kills the whole rest of it, right? And then we talked about access controls, next generation AV, email security. So take a look at the anti-phishing things that we do, training, email security, DNS URL filtering, software security, things like that. And browser security, and you'll understand the things you ought to do. So for the first recommendation on that other 10% is develop a ransomware risk assessment. I actually do these for data breach, ransomware, and anti-phishing. I just tailor them, and there'll be certain controls that are more effective than others. And I just do that periodically and then trend those. But develop one for ransomware risk assessment. When I've done that, we've got about 14 or 15 factors that we periodically assess. So do that. And then a major compensating control is always condition or control monitoring. Monitoring, and we do that a lot with our security tools and the rest of that stuff, but you gotta make sure the monitoring maps back to what your key your key threat vectors are, like we mentioned earlier, right? And then I believe you need to improve the bad actor detection, that east-west that they talk about a lot. Find those guys a lot faster, because remember, our job is to make the hacker's job hard. And there's a process by which they go through that you've seen, the cyber kill chain they call it, but there are different levels that they take, and our job is to put controls in between each one of those to make their job harder. That way it takes them longer and we might see them, and so we get a little bit more time and easier to detect them. So improving the bad actor detection is very big for all of us, not just that other 10%. And then I just want to put in a little plug for deception. People usually say honeypots and things like that, but you can. There's a couple of things you can do out there. I'll have to give a plug for canary tokens. We've used those. They're a really good bell ringer, and so it's kind of cool. So in short, this is a pretty virulent threat. So conduct a tailored risk assessment and conduct it periodically. And putting another plug is start investing in your zero trust journey. Like I mentioned earlier, put a strategy together. Again, you've got some pieces of it already, just align it. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
I got that T-shirt too.
Yeah, right. I was being hacked. No, I'm just kidding. You mentioned authentication earlier, and many legacy protocols or applications used in the public sector, or even sometimes in the private sector, are not compatible for that mandated two-factor or multi-factor authentication. Just wondering what your advice is on transforming into that modern identity-based authentication.
Yeah, so the authentication challenges for modern web apps are principally because we've advanced the way we install and implement, right? They're distributed across servers. They use APIs for data to retrieve and consume data, like for example, a RESTful API, and then they rely on downstream services. A services call another one, and many of the legacy applications just can't do that. So, and the principal concern is the legacy application is pretty simplistic, really doesn't have any intel that we can then apply to individual scientists consider risk scenarios and how to respond. For instance, they don't provide necessarily a second factor authentication. Simple examples, SMTP, POP3, IMAP4, those kind of things. So what's happened is whoever gets your credentials is able to continue their malicious phishing campaigns or whatever. So the first step is to identify who and what is using legacy identification. This is a theme throughout. Whenever I talk to anybody, you have to know what you have and where it's at, right? Be it data, be it devices, be it services, whatever it is. You just conduct an inventory and figure out what you have there and which ones are sign-ins or genuine user access, or maybe they're indicators of IOCs, indicators of compromise of account credentials. So identify what you got, and then you have to then take an assessment and figure out which ones are needed, which ones can't be currently supported by other modern authentication methods, etc. And then see if you can better validate the user access through client configurations. And for those gaps, for those that are needed and it cannot be modernized, then you're going to need to look at other options like middleware, gateways, portals, proxies, that kind of stuff to get something in the middle that will assist you with that. So last point would be to tightly manage legacy authentication to both your service configurations, conditional access, so you don't just give up the ghost. Goes back to one of the ones I just mentioned earlier. You have to manage that. Everything we do in cyber requires configuration management. And this is no different.
Exactly. So as we close out the discussion, one question: shall we just get rid of the BPN? And what are your suggestive zero trust guidelines there?
Well, that's like getting rid of passwords. They're going to be a need for them in the near future, so or even longer as an alternate or whatever. So legacy devices, fallback options, you pick it. So the transition, goes back to a little bit what we talked about earlier. Improve the IAM posture, consider a portal, a common login base. A lot of people do that now, one place to log in, so integrate them with those. But in my view, it's better to plan for the future state of connecting. I think most people are familiar with SASE, Secure Access Secure Service Edge. Pretty cool. It combines a lot of the features of VPNs, SD-WAN, CASB, web gateways, firewalls, and of course, zero trust. So I'm a big fan of that. So I would suggest folks, wherever they're going from a connectivity perspective, again, have a strategy, work with ops and IT, see where you're going, and you have probably some of these things I just mentioned already. Once they're integrated, in my view, it's kind of like the zero trust journey. It's several pieces of it. Get a strategy and work your way forward. In this case, I'm pretty enamored by SASE. I think it's a good way to go for connecting. So, in short, develop a strategy with ops and IT. You can and put your SASE roadmap into play while moving away from VPNs and isolating those where you can. So you'll see a theme here when I keep talking about strategies and working with ops. You do those two things, you come out with a combined roadmap and just about anything you want, and you can show leadership a residual risk reduction story, which is what you want to do.
Right. No, that's great. We were recording an earlier session talking about how some industries are just catching up to this decade's worth of technology. Really need to be planning for the future.
Exactly. Yeah, you gotta try to play leapfrog, right? You gotta see that's the hard part of everything we do. Keeping legacy going, which is costly. We get all that. It's got security implications now. We get all that while moving towards the future. Sure. And sometimes folks moving towards the future is we're just going to go all in the cloud. But that does you still have to plan the future of where you're going. That isn't that simple. Yeah, it's simpler than maintaining on-prem and the rest, but that's their future state. And I would say no, you have to have an access, just like we said, access control future state, where you're going on the applications. Are you a software shop? Therefore, you got to enable IaaS and SaaS apps and things like that. So those are the things you need to take a look at, not just, so having a strategy, overall strategy with a couple of those buckets we just mentioned about, that's your future state. And I have to just leave, being a system engineer, we go from as is to future state. If it's a fuzzy future state, it's a little hard to get there. There's an old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any path will do.
It's true.
Cyber, I tweaked that a little bit. If you don't know where you're going, any blind alley will do. Putting all those resources into something that might be a sunk cost and you can't get anything out of it for the future.
Right. No, great points. Well, thank you, Mike, so much for being with us today to talk through zero trust risk-based assessment and use of it in securing our cybersecurity postures and making us safer for the future. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks. I would put a plug in for Air Gap in the because I went through a demo on their kill switch. Do yourself a favor, take a look at it. It's something different, and think about that. It's in ransomware. It's all about isolating quickly. So isolating almost immediately fills that bill.
That's awesome. Great. Well,
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Take care. So we've covered a couple of different topics here so far today. We've talked about the government's response to the increasing threat of ransomware. We've talked about some real-world examples in the healthcare industry. We've even talked about how to assess your risk posture and strengthen it. And finally, I think this works out well that we're ending with a session with CEO and founder of Air Gap Networks, Ritesh Agrawal, to talk about enterprise solutions that can help you combat ransomware utilizing zero trust and ransomware kill switches. So let's take it away for this final conversation with Ritesh. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CISO Roundtable discussion series, Ransomware and Recovery 2021. This is sponsored by Air Gap Networks and the Cyber Future Foundation. Today, we're actually excited to welcome the CEO and founder, Ritesh Agrawal of Air Gap Networks. So Ritesh, welcome.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Great. It's great to have you here. So in this session, we are going to want to cover securing your enterprise network with zero trust isolation. As a lot of us know, the lateral movement is what turns an attack on a single endpoint into a huge breach. It's a secret ingredient of many ransomwares that are successful, the breaches that are successful that drive all the headlines. And I'm hoping you're going to be able to explain to us a little bit about the fundamental gaps that currently exist in organizations' security posture and why enterprises really need to be thinking differently and carrying this zero trust isolation mindset, whether it's on-premise, off-premise, into their security planning for the future. But before we get started on that particular topic, Ritesh, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to our audience, a little bit about your role and a little bit about AirGap's mission.
Absolutely. So, hi folks, my name is Ritesh Agrawal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of AirGap Networks, and the mission for AirGap from day one has been to prevent high-profile ransomware breaches for our customers and for our prospects. The company was started about 2 years ago. Prior to this, I was actually running Juniper Networks, the security portfolio business for data center and service provider. And this is during that role, I realized that there are some fundamental flaws that are not being addressed by any vendor in the industry for our customers. And that was the genesis of AirGap. And I'll be glad to discuss some of those flaws today.
That's great. Let's start there because the traditional model of defense in depth approach to risk mitigation and sort of protecting business information and valuable data has been around, and it's been about practicing layers of defense over the past decade or something. But we realize that there's obviously something going wrong here. And I'm just wondering, what do you see as some of the fundamental flaws in the current systems?
See, we've been talking about this all along that there is very little protection against lateral movement of threat inside the organization. However, it is very surprising, rather shocking, that no vendor has come forward and provided a very, very potent solution, if I must. And that's the reason we see so many flaws. And I see and feel very sorry for some of the customers who are buying millions of dollars of gear, adding layers and layers of protection to protect their perimeter, all the while knowing and fully accepting the reality that the perimeter is going to get breached someday or other. And once that happens, there is very little we can do against lateral propagation. If we think about why this flaw exists, this flaw is the result of 3+ decades old blueprint or a corporate campus blueprint that is based on VLAN infrastructure. VLANs were introduced in 1980s by Cisco and Nortel, and the purpose there really was to reduce the broadcast domain. Somehow, over the years, customers and IT teams started using VLANs for security, which is not what they were designed to do. And now we are left with broadcast domain with thousands of devices on each of those VLANs, and any one infected device has the potential to infect everything else. And there is no visibility or control available on those VLANs, especially when it comes to unmanaged devices. And that's the fundamental flaw number one that we need to address instantly or immediately. And that's what AirGap's focus is.
That's great. So again, you're hitting home this point of endpoint has been a little bit more popular, but really the specific around device cybersecurity, both managed and unmanaged devices. I'm curious, how would you leverage zero trust isolation for unmanaged devices?
So this is the situation where, especially for unmanaged devices, and even to an extent managed devices, when you deploy an endpoint agent, um, that's the only layer of protection you have. And if that protection fails, then you are vulnerable. For the unmanaged devices, you don't even have that layer of protection. These
Right.
are practically black boxes. Um, Many of these unmanaged devices are designed and developed in parts of the world where security may not be the number one priority. And now you're left with a VLAN inside your corporate environment with a bunch of managed and unmanaged devices, all of those vulnerable. And unfortunately, because of the VLAN nature, you're trusting them fully to communicate with each other, to be safe. Once they're inside the organization, nothing bad can happen. And the reality is that's not true. And that's what the bad actors actually exploit day in, day out. And they also know that this is the weakest link inside the organization. And again, when I think about security, I always think about very simple terms. So, in simple terms, you are as secure as the weakest spot inside your
Of course.
organization. I think your weakest spot is one that is not protected well. And that is the endpoints, both managed and unmanaged, and most typically in a shared VLAN infrastructure.
Right. And I mean, the way that I've seen it in my experience in cybersecurity also is that we know that once you're being breached, that threat actor has likely been in your system for quite some time. And they're probably a lot better at locating these vulnerable devices than you might be, than your own security department, your IT department might be. These are lapsed devices and things that haven't been used in a long time. And given that people are used to this big flat network, how do you see people being ready to move into this disruptive innovation and moving into protecting device by device, endpoint by endpoint?
So I'll tell you two things. First thing, you hit it home when you said there are lots of devices inside the organization that are probably already breached. And now, what I hear in the dark web channels is some of these devices are available for rent.
Mhm.
Uh, so bad actors could literally rent these devices, and somebody can buy them for rent them for like a month or something. And now, how do you know your organization is not available for rent? So that's number one. The second thing, in terms of how do we ensure that these devices are protected from the bad internet and from each other to begin with, the only common denominator we have is the network. So air gaps construct is network based. However, I have done this, I've been doing infrastructure business, especially security business, for more than a decade now. I know that nobody likes disruption. Nobody likes to
Right.
go and rip cables and move stuff around and buy a new gear. So when I started air gap, that was the primary concern for me, is to make sure that we deliver something that is incremental and that does not require any upgrades or updates to existing equipments or investment that the customers have made. So there is a very simple and very elegant way of solving this problem without eh, touching any of your existing infrastructure,
Wow.
without requesting customers to install agents or anything, and yet be able to zero trust isolate all of those devices in a sort of ring fence of their own, so that one
Right.
infected device cannot infect other, and thereby limiting the threat to a single device. And that's a very manageable outcome compared to what if you had 1,000 or 2,000, or in case of more,
Right.
25,000 devices infected.
That's so interesting. I mean, and that's the notion of this kill switch, which of course we've seen in gas stations all over the country, all over the world, any kind of other environments where there are real hazardous materials. You know, all of these other factories, places have figured out how to have a kill switch for a dangerous moment. I'm just curious, why haven't we thought about that before? And how did that come into your thinking when you were founding the company?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. And the ransomware kill switch is a very clever and a very potent response. And the genesis of this, to be honest with you, and I'll give credit where it is due, it came as an input from a customer. And he
Huh,
said, look, I love your product. I love the fact that you can stop the propagation of threat inside my organization. But let's be clear that sometimes things happen not because your product didn't work, because somebody messed up, somebody configured something incorrectly. Human errors are always possible,
right,
and can you give me a solution where I don't have to watch my house burn down? I have a button that I can press. And that led to thinking. And since we had the control on every device, how and where they communicate, we were able to implement this ransomware kill switch. And you said it absolutely correctly, which is every gas station should have a switch. I wouldn't want to go to a gas station, or at least the one that is closest to my house. I would want
right,
every station to have that switch, because someday it'll save lives. Instead of blowing 4 blocks radius, it'll be probably 100 square feet worth of damage, which is something we can probably digest. Another analogy I use is every commercial building has the sprinkler on the
right.
ceiling,
Mhm.
and God forbid if you get into a situation where there is fire, you would be able to contain the damage and not let the building burn down. So think of ransomware kill switch is exactly like that. You can surgically stop access or communication to certain crown jewels. You can surgically eliminate all unnecessary communication. For example, if you are infected with ransomware and you know it, you have millions of dollars invested in these systems that are generating all kinds of alerts for you,
Right.
you will be able to stop access to unnecessary services like Facebook or
Right.
Netflix or something like that. You will be able to stop access to certain very key services, which could be your storage, your backup, and all of this with just a single click. And that's what the air gaps promises with ransomware kill switch.
So, as we're thinking about moving into 2021, we're now this recovery period of the digital transformation, and a lot of businesses are talking about going back on premise and also working in a hybrid environment. We had a great conversation with Chris Kistler talking about medical devices. What have you seen in ransomware and how it's been evolving over the last decade or so? And how do you actually see it further evolving in the next year or two?
Look, ransomware pandemic seems to have no end in sight as far as I'm concerned. And there are very fundamental reasons. Again, very simple thinking. For any criminal enterprise, two key ingredients are anonymity and obviously be able to financial motivation essentially. And if
Sure.
you think about ransomware, they both the ingredients are available: anonymity of cryptocurrency, and of course
Sure.
the last demand I heard, and this is just based on the news releases, that Acer is expected to pay about $100 million in ransom. God knows how much money in terms of reputation damage and recovery and all of those things. We are talking big numbers now, and these numbers are floating around in the underground black hat community as well, and they kind of um, see what's going on, and maybe we are creating more interest in the community to to create more ransomware. So this is going to happen. The second thing we've also always noticed is whenever there is an economic depression, the cyber criminals the cyber activity kind of grows a lot. And
Sure.
we clearly in one of those situations at the moment, given the pandemic, especially for the middle and lower middle class income, where we have more economic depression than the other strata of the
Sure.
society. So all of this are a clear indication that we'll see more and more ransomware going forward. And the third thing I would tell you to add to those two is people have been working from home for almost 15 months, 14 months
Right.
now. And these devices are largely unchecked and they've been in so-called insecure home network. I mean, let's face it, most of us have Netgear or D-Link or something for security at our home. These are not clearly enterprise grade security products. These are consumer products. So when you come back to office, it's likely that you're going to bring these devices back to office, and there is going to be higher number of these devices that are possibly infected or corrupted. And if you bring them to office, I'm petrified to know what could possibly happen
Right.
when everybody is back in office. And that day is coming. In depending
Sure.
on the organization you have, it may be sooner or later, but it's not like we will never come back to office. I think that's probably a stretch goal.
Right. Well, and I know that there's CISOs out there across the board, individuals who are responsible for the IT for a company and security for a company, and it can be overwhelming. There's a lot of different challenges that are facing cybersecurity professionals these days. And now, with really in-depth thinking around zero trust isolation, how would you advise a company to think about phasing this in, about migrating their business and being secure in the future without, allowing them to not be so overwhelmed by the prospect of it?
That's the biggest draw. I think I when I talk to customers, many of them fear this zero trust and fear that there's going to be huge amount of work or huge body of work, and that has largely been true, to be honest with you, in the past.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we did with air gap is provided that steady and slow migration. And I tell this to everybody: zero trust is a journey. You cannot have a magic wand where air gap or any other company just move the van
Right.
and almost all of a sudden you're zero trust. It's not. First thing first, zero trust is the only way you can protect yourself. There is no getting out of that, in my opinion.
Right.
uh, Having done security for a number of years and talked to customers, especially the ones that have been infected, I can tell you zero trust is the only way out for you. um, Also, zero trust needs to be implemented step by step, one network at a time, few employees, few endpoints at a time. And you give yourself 6 months, you give yourself 12 months, depending on the size of your organization. And this is a journey, you'll get there. Air Gap's zero trust isolation provides the migration one application at a time, one network at a time, or one user at a time.
Mhm.
And we let customers decide, and we help customers actually. Let's identify a set of users that you're willing to protect on day one, and we will work with them and we'll protect those users. And they're all now zero trust isolated from each other. And then we can add another VLAN or another network
Right.
or other stuff. And that's the journey that we want to take with the customers.
Yes. Well, again, we've spoken with a lot of folks that everyone's going to hear from today with the CISO Roundtable discussions, and it's very clear that the government is stepping in. There are going to be regulations. There's going to be help from the government even. There's going to be help from lots of other corporations, and really a banding together of the industry to see what the real solutions need to be and how they need to be implemented. As we wrap up our session today, Ritesh, I'm just wondering, do you have any final thoughts for folks when they're thinking through zero trust isolation? And really creating a security plan for the future?
Absolutely. First of all, regarding government regulation, I think the regulations have been to an extent in place, whether it's government or compliances, where segmentation is demanded. People have not really taken it seriously. It's about time that they do. Zero trust is the only way out, and it's going to be a journey.
We've come to the end here, folks, and we appreciate your time. It is precious these days, and we appreciate that you spent this last hour and 45 minutes with us learning about ransomware response by the government, risk assessment, specific industry examples, as well as enterprise solutions to help you combat ransomware. For those of you that are joining us with Zoom webinar, please remember we are about to begin a live Q&A with CEO and founder of Air Gap Networks, Ritesh Agarwal. For those of you who might have had to step away or just found some of this content really compelling and want to share it with colleagues, please know you can find all of the sessions individually at AirGap's Bright Talk channel. Thank you so much for joining us again. We appreciate you.
I'd like to tell you a little bit more about one of our sponsors, Air Gap Networks. The threat of ransomware is growing rapidly. While there are a whole bunch of security companies that are trying to prevent ransomware from getting into your network, AirGap's Zero Trust Isolation platform protects your organization even if your perimeter is breached or if you have unpatched vulnerable servers inside your data center. Additionally, AirGap's Ransomware Kill Switch is the most potent ransomware response for the IT organization. AirGap can be deployed in minutes without any agents, forklift upgrades, or design changes. The company is founded by highly experienced cybersecurity experts, and the solution is trusted by large enterprises and service providers alike. For more details, check out https://airgap.io.